Keith Winstein serves as the executive director at the Brevard Zoo in Melbourne, Florida, the zoo I visited only last month, and it's really great. His work in conservation education and exhibit development has won him numerous national awards. He's helped develop professional training programs in the United States, Brazil, and China. He's professionally active in the AZA, where he's chaired the Conservation Education Committee, and he currently serves as a board member. He's chair of the Brevard County Nature Alliance, a board member of Florida Blood Centers, and numerous other organizations in conservation and in community service. Keith believes that an unstructured time spent outside, whether in urban, suburban, or rural settings, is an essential part of a healthy childhood. And he works to connect people to nature in every way that he can. We couldn't have a better speaker, Keith.
Thanks. This is going to be hard for me for two reasons. First, I'm a wanderer, and I've been told to stay at the podium. No walking. And second, I was told that I need to think 50 to 100 years in the future, and that's really hard for me. I don't know about the rest of you, but 5 years is about as far out as I usually go. So I started thinking, how am I going to think that far? I thought, well, maybe I'll go backwards, and let me start, not quite 50 years, but yeah, close to that. This is me. I'm in kindergarten. If you can spot me, I'm the semi-normal looking kid in the white shirt, top row, second from the right next to Jonathan Spitz. The question that I asked is, how did I get from there to here? This is 2 summers ago. That's a western hognose snake, which is a fantastic animal. I was out with a bunch of zoo directors birding in South Dakota, and we found that animal. And so how did I get from this relatively normal individual to this person who hangs out with zoo professional, picks up snakes, and spends their free time birding? And so I thought back and said, what formal education experiences from zoos might have brought me to that point? And I sort of opened my mind, and 4 things came through, none of which really fit the bill. First thing I remembered was that when I was somewhere in 2nd or 3rd grade, this spider lady came from the American Museum of Natural History and brought tarantulas and scorpions and other things to the school. I couldn't remember her name, but I thought that was really cool. Okay, that was sort of formal education from an informal science place. And then for reasons I don't know, the second memory was a similar thing. An opera lady came, and she came to the school, and I thought was cool was she explained to us how her voice could break glass. She never actually broke the glass, but I still remember that. This is the memories. This is just me thinking. The next memory I had was interesting. It was at a zoo in Holland where there was a solitary kangaroo in an exhibit. I can't remember the name of the zoo, and I grew up outside of New York City, so I was at the Bronx Zoo all the time. You would have thought I'd be full of Bronx Zoo memories. But the memory I had was of this solitary kangaroo and how sad it made me feel. And then finally, I did have a Bronx Zoo memory. The memory that really came to mind strongest was I was really interested in herps when I was a kid, and I had this memory of weaseling my way into the herp curator's office at the Bronx Zoo when I was like 12, and what a thrill that was. And so I ask all of you, which of these educational things had the biggest impact on my life? Well, you know, I think it was John Baylor, and late great John Baylor was a great herpetologist. It's the fact that he took a little time with me when I was a kid for me to babble on about reptiles and amphibians. And I thought all of this tells you something, that formal education programs in the traditional sense didn't have a lot to do with me. So let's go back a little farther, since our goal was to go back 50 to 100 years. We're going to go back next and just take a look at what the role of education that's been changing in zoos has been for a long time. First public zoo, the Menagerie in Paris. After the French Revolution, they threw it open. This is an art class taking place in the zoo. And what's interesting is if you read about what the leaders at the time wanted the zoo to do, they wanted it for public education because there wasn't public education, and they were sort of worried up eventually about catching up with the industrial age and the British, and how do you train the great mass of workers? So the zoo was this place for public education. First zoo I worked at, Roger Williams Park Zoo, also had a Victorian museum. And literally, it was called the People's University, right? This were places of public education. It wasn't for formal education for school groups. It was literally for the great masses that came through. And teaching them important things like taxonomy, as if we think taxonomy is important today. So remember, this first phase of education, you're dealing with the public, the people who walk through the door. Well, what happened next? We went to what I call the school marm phase. This is not a school marm. This is one of the gorilla women at the Bronx Zoo. But the Bronx Zoo in 1929 sort of had the first educational program for formal groups, for schools. And they had literally a school marm-like person who would teach them programs. And we were really in that phase until fairly recently. Education at zoos focused on formal school programs. And I think sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, that sort of changed. And the public became our audience again. And I pulled up Beverly Sorrell's book, which is a great book. And Beverly was one of a number of exhibit designers and label creators who started to first put down what she thought some rules were. And she had two ideas that were major and influential. One was the idea of the big idea, that each exhibit should have a single focus. And the other was the idea that the 50% rule, she called it, that if we could teach the public, half of them, 50% of them, a key concept, that big idea, then we've accomplished something. So I want to give you some examples of that. This is at our zoo. This is our South American loop. And if you can read the two little signs, it says, can you read them? Every animal gives to the forest gives to every animal. Now, when people come to our zoo, this is what all the labels look like in that area. They all ask the question, what do they give to the forest? What does the forest give to them? And invariably, when educators come to our zoo, they comment on how focused this is, how thoughtful this is. The same themes repeated over and over again. I don't think the visitor really cares at all. I mean, they're nice, they're focused, they conform that, and maybe they learn something out of it. But in some ways, this view of public education as teaching concepts like this is pretty flawed. I don't think they care. We care a lot. It looks really nice and focused to us. And we've built on that. We created all these fancy interactives, things that move, things that light up, things that go bang, all of these things over the years. And we've actually learned to measure it. And I can tell you, I can create an exhibit, and I can measure it, and I can get some really measurable outcomes, things people learn, things people feel, even things people do. We've tracked people out 6 months later. We can change their behaviors. We can do that. And so the question I ask is, we can teach them facts and concepts at the zoo, but should we? Is that really the role of the zoo? Are we this place that creates and passes on information and concepts and ideas? And the reason I ask that is, remember that spider lady? Okay, she was pretty influential to me. I couldn't remember her name. I asked my assistant to look it up. 7 minutes later, she found the spider lady on the internet. Her name was Alice Gray, and she died in 1994. All the information is there. Remember the interactives that we talked about, that we create this stuff that goes bang and whiz and boom? Well, you can do that all at the internet. When I was at Brookfield Zoo, we created this Ways of Knowing trail. I'm still proud of it. I think it was a really sophisticated interactive game. It even printed you out a certificate when you're done. So those sort of interactivities, they can happen anywhere. They can happen on the web. They don't need the zoo to do that. And so I think the answer to that question of what you want to teach them very much comes back to what the mission of your institution is. And I think it's perfectly appropriate. If the mission of your institution is to educate people about geology, then you should teach them about geology. Most zoo missions today focus on conservation. So the mission of my zoo is wildlife conservation through education and participation. And I firmly believe we should back that up. But the definition of education, how that fits there, has sort of changed because of it. And one thing I want to make sure everybody knows is this idea that teaching information, that knowledge leads to attitude change, which leads to behavior change, really couldn't be further from the truth. The connection between those things are very weak at best. We can note, for example, I'll give you a really good personal example. I know it's not good to speed, okay? Speeding's a bad thing. First of all, it uses more gas. Second of all, it puts me at risk. And worst of all, these predators, they call policemen, are lying out there, and they give me big, expensive tickets. Having all that information and having an attitude that really, I don't want to get a ticket, doesn't change my behavior at all. I have a lead foot, right? So bottom line is, knowledge and attitude isn't enough to change behavior. So education at the zoo, if we wanted to support conservation change, needs to do more than that. All right. So that's sort of a background. And the important thing here is that we've gone from public audiences to formal audiences to public audiences. It's hard for me to look out 50 years and say, who are we going to focus on then? So I wanted to talk about some general trends that I think will happen after the next 50 years. And then I'll look from 50 to 100 years and look at one interesting idea that's a little far out there and see how that might affect us. All right, so these are the trends I'm going to go over. The blurring of boundaries between formal and informal education, authenticity as our sole currency, offering more and more levels of engagement, increasing demand for personalization, customization, and gateway for connecting to local nature. And you probably picked up already that I'm very much, this is too sharp, very much interested in that last one. Is something that we focus a lot on because of my initial stories about connecting with nature and how that affects us. But let's start with this. Let's all play this game called formal or informal. Informal education is when a class comes in, you're booked for something ahead of time. Informal is when people just show up at your institution and it happens. So is this a formal class or an informal class? It looks informal, doesn't it? But this is formal, right? This is a Frog Watch. This is a program that goes through AZA. These are people who signed up to be educated about how to identify frogs in their backyard. Looks like fun, right? But this is a formal class that's happening at our zoo. Adults, kids, and together. What about this? Formal or informal? This sort of looks formal, but this actually is informal. One of the things we do at our zoo all the time is we try to engage the guest in actual conservation behaviors, right? So we have a mangrove program. Guests can come to the zoo. We have Girl Scouts who staff it. They can actually pot a mangrove and take it home, right? And then we have and we track them. They have Facebook pages. They tell us how their mangroves are doing. And then we have what's called mangrove homecoming. They bring the mangroves home to us, right? And they've brought them back. They've cared for their mangroves for a year. They've given them a name. And then, if they really want, they can go out with us and do some shoreline restoration work and actually plant those mangroves. We do that with schools. We do that with nursing homes. We do that with visitors at the zoo. The idea that programs simply happen for formal or informal groups have gone away for us. You start to blur those things. The core programs you do, I think, serve everybody for reasons we're going to get to in a minute. And that's because they're really, really authentic. And if you look, Gilmore and Pine have this great series of books about what public's looking for. There was a time where people were looking for theming because they were looking for experiences. Now they're looking for things that are real, right? They don't want to see a shrimp fishing museum. They want to go shrimp fishing. They want to go on a real shrimp boat and do that. We're authentic. We're really authentic. This is an authentic experience. That is a real armadillo. You can't do that, as we said yesterday, with technology. You can only experience an armadillo that way. And you can only experience the volunteer sitting next to them actually being with them. Or this. Do you think Marie's can ever forget being licked by a giraffe? And look at the keeper, right? So the keeper's enthusiastic. By the way, this happens every day at our zoo all the time. Giraffe feeding is a constant thing that goes on, right? These are really authentic experiences, and that is our currency. Someone said it yesterday, our animal collection is what defines us. That is what makes us different. Here's another case, but we're not just the animal collection. We're actually the programs we do. This is a butterfly watch program we do. That's a real lepidopterist. Those are real people asking questions about butterflies. They're now out surveying butterflies as transects around our county. This is an authentic experience that we won't forget. What about this? This is the third time we're doing dinosaurs in 10 years at our zoo. Are these authentic? They're big. They're rubber. They move and make noise. They are not real. They're not authentic. But we actually run an expedition out to Wyoming when we do these and collect real dinosaur bones to bring these authentic stories to our experience, because that is real. We send volunteers who want to go. The volunteers come back. They talk about picking up these bones. And it's a Triceratops femur that you're looking at. So, second theme that I think is always going to be important and we have to keep focused to education is authenticity, real animals, real projects, real people, real stories, real experiences. And don't forget the stories and the people. They're equally important. Nobody wants to talk to me at the zoo, but they sure want to talk to my keepers or the volunteers and went out and collected these dinosaur bones. And then multiple levels of engagement. It used to be you came to the zoo and you sort of all did the same thing. And this is an age of customization, Gen X and Gen Y. You want what you want when you want it, right? You grew up with instant access to information. You want those things, and it's changed all of us. So we demand this sort of level of engagement. And let me just go over that for a minute. So the old-fashioned level of engagement at a zoo is you might read a graphic. This is at our children's zoo. We do all this work with oyster restoration, and this is a sign about the oysters, and you can see the oyster mats. You can see that sort of mesh in there. That's the very lowest level of engagement. This was referred to yesterday. A lot of zoos have stolen this idea from Zoo Boise called Quarters for Conservation. So everybody who comes to our zoo, there's a quarter surcharge. You have no choice, you have to pay it. And we give you a little token. And basically we tell you, okay, where do you want to go today? There's 3 different projects. This was a prototype. We have a nicer one now. There's 3 different projects listed. You put that token in the project you want to support. And then at the end of 3 months, we gather up all the tokens and we count them and we give the amount of money that people voted on. So I can't take credit for this idea. Steve Burns from Boise came up with it. It means every guest coming through the zoo has some engagement with our conservation programs, and then we report back to them. So although I think asking people to give money or asking people to vote are sort of the standard ways we ask people to help conservation, at least this way they actually do it while they're there and they have a conversation. We watch parents have a conversation with kids, and they're engaged in that process. Some people blow it off. Some people, it's the highlight of their trip. It's different for everybody, but at least it's the next level of engagement. Here's the next level up for that. Oyster mats, we taught that little sign about oysters. We actually do oyster mats at our zoo. We make them at our zoo, and then they go out in the lagoon, and we restore the oyster populations. And we do oyster mat workshops all the time at the zoo and elsewhere. So when you come to the zoo that day, you actually can make an oyster mat, and you can help restore habitat while you're there. It takes about 10 minutes. You're actually doing a conservation behavior. And this we do know. If you do a conservation behavior, next time someone asks you, are you a conservationist, you tend to self-reflect and say, am I a conservationist? Why, yes, I made an oyster mat. I must be a conservationist. I already gave 10 minutes of my time to do that. So that's the next level of engagement. And then we have these really hardy souls who come out with us in the lagoon and actually put these things in the height of Florida summer, and that is a really good time. First, you have to knock down the margins, and you put these things in, and you weight them down with these little donut weights. That's another level of engagement. All those levels, people pick where they want to participate on their visit, and that's what people demand. And I think more and more in the future, they're going to want that in their visit. They're going to want to have different levels of engagement educationally. And the schools demand this too, right? So we have a nice Indian River Lagoon website. Turns out nobody cares about that level of engagement. Nobody uses it. There's plenty of other good websites out there. What is really popular is we take schools out for a day in the Indian River Lagoon. We have them saying for the diversity there. That there's huge demand for. So much demand that even as the budget's been cut, people continue to do this. And then we even have stronger levels of engagement. This is our cave classroom. I lied. I told someone earlier there's no rock work at our zoo. The only rock work at our zoo is in our classrooms, actually. This is the entrance to the cave classroom, and one of the classrooms we have. And these kids actually spend 4 to 9 weeks of the zoo year at the zoo. This is where they come to school every day. They get on their bus at school. They come to the zoo. They're with us for 4 to 9 weeks. This is not atypical now in the zoo world. And what's interesting here is the curriculum's fairly similar to their regular school curriculum. The difference is that they're in this zoo setting. And that's a different level of engagement that the schools love, and they fight over it. And then this is a project we do. We figured out, someone mentioned translocation yesterday, that the Fish and Wildlife Service comes to zoos a lot and says, please help us figure something out. In this case, how do we translocate scrub jays, a federally endangered species, very endemic to Central Florida. We need to figure out the technique for doing that. This is a local middle school teacher. It happened to be that the scrub jays that needed to be moved were on the school property. He got very engaged. He became Mr. Scrub Jay, so that's a new level of engagement as well. And finally, and this goes very much with this piece about levels of engagement, is it's really customized to fit people, to fit them personally, to fit them physically, to fit them wherever they're coming from. So there are some zoo interactives I think still really work really well. And those are the ones that are still personal, right? When a child holds up his wingspan against a bird, you can't really do that on a computer. It's a little different. There's a physical nature of it, or uses this giraffe periscope at Brookfield Zoo. This is my favorite at our zoo. You get on a scale, and depending on your weight, it tells you how many days it would take for the vultures to pick you clean, right? Fun. And it doesn't, I think, yeah, the weight's still on there. So, no, it's only days. We took the weights off because we found a certain cohort wouldn't use it otherwise. Here's a very personal choice. If you're 9, 10, 12 years old, when I was growing up, zoos were still cool. They're not today. So we now have adventure courses through our zoo. For people that age, that is the choice they want to do. They don't want to look at animals. They want to be an animal and be up in the trees. It's been remarkably successful for us. We thought we'd be focusing on 15-year-old boys. After the first 6 months of data, 63% female, and our average age is 32. So we completely missed the boat on that. Turned out all those mothers who brought young children, they really wanted to get away from the trees, but it worked. And even donors. I was talking to Jeff Bonner about that, and everything's personalized. He was telling me about a donor with very strong opinions on what he wanted to do. You're going to personalize your gift with donors, right? You're going to create the program for them that they want. So everything's customized today. Technology allows us to do that, but it's a mindset that comes everywhere. And one of the speakers yesterday mentioned graphics. I mean, graphics are going to be a way of the past only because people only want the information they want. Now, I think they'll always want to know what it is, and they'll always want to know where in the exhibit it is. But beyond that, it's going to be completely personal if they want to know anything at all. And that's the graphic stuff. We even customize all our ticketing processes now, right? Everything's customized to when you're coming, what you want to do. And then we serve so many different audiences with different needs, special needs audiences. Obviously, we've been customizing to them for years, but we're going to do a lot more of that. We're starting to work with senior citizen audiences, for example, caretakers of people with Alzheimer's. They need a break, so we're going to be working with folks with Alzheimer's. I think in the future, you're going to see the full spectrum of audiences. Everything's customized. Okay. And all of it comes down to this idea of, can we, in children and families, bring them a little back to connect to nature? Because as we've talked about, there's no electrical outlets outside. Kids don't want to play there. All right, so how do we do this? And here's the question that I ask going into the future. We right now get to play. I'm in Florida. I can go outside and within 20 minutes see sea turtles, manatees, dolphins, eagles, caracara. I have all these sexy, charismatic species that are right over me and around me. When I worked at the Brookfield Zoo, we had the prairie-fringed orchid. And if you were really lucky, you could try to work on Massasaugas, which I thought was cool, but they were so locally rare, there was no choice. In Florida, we have this incredible richness of interesting species, things that people seem interested in. Indigo snakes, beach mice, red wolves historically in the southeast, butterflies, scrub jays. That's given us a huge advantage to engage people in what I'm calling education in these local conservation projects. Well, how do you do that in Buffalo, right? How do you do that at Brookfield Zoo? How do you do that in places that you don't have all of that really what people consider cool native wildlife around you? And so I asked the question looking 50 years forward, what's going to be native, right? What's going to be local? And this is where it gets sort of fun. You know, we didn't really think they'd get communicators from Star Wars 25 years ago, and we have them. What happens if we start having transporters? What happens if everything becomes local, you know? What happens if all of these species we work with at Brevard Zoo become local species? John said it yesterday, because you can get to them in 20 minutes, half an hour. What if the whole world becomes local? What if the projects we do now that seem foreign and exotic become something you can get it to? What if these folks become our neighbors, right? So that changes the whole game about what zoo education could be, because everything becomes a local program. So that's my wild and crazy thought for today. And ultimately, anyone know what this is? It's the second rarest thing in our zoo. Yes, who said that? Wow, very good, Visayan warty pig. It's got a nice mohawk on it. It's become popular in zoos, very rare animals from the Philippines. But you know, ultimately, this might not be the best example of a keeper in with them, but that's the sort of connection. I want everybody to feel that connected to a Visayan warty pig. If I've done that, then I've done my job, and that's sort of my definition of education. Thank you.